Good evening, everybody. My name is David Steiner. I'm the director of the CUNY Institute for Education Policy. Welcome, welcome. We, from the beginning, have been dedicated to including all aspects of K-20 education within our purview. And that very crucially, of course, includes the private sector. This is really, however, the first major event that we've held that looks at some empirical data around that sector, and we have a wonderful lineup of speakers to think about the results that you'll be about to be exposed to. It's a particular privilege for me because I grew up in a very different system in England, which was one in which the division between public and private was quite different, of course, than it is here. I was excused from prayers at a state-run school. Some of the students next to me had their very modest tuition paid for by the state, and others paid tuition. It was called a direct grant school because a direct grant came from the government for underprivileged students. We were all there on exam entry. As you can tell, I've just mixed up about 5 categories that in this country would be kept in a rather different position. But enough from me. Let us move very quickly to a presentation from Ray Pennings. I will not read everything that's on your card because you can see how distinguished Ray is, but just to say that it's very, very important for us not only to be expanding the Institute's reach to embrace private schools, but also to think across the border. And this research, of course, coming to us in part from experts outside the United States. My own homeland is engaged right now in a rather aggravated and aggravating debate about whether the Scots will stay with us or not. Borders are important, but they're important also to overcome. And so it's a delight to have Cardus with us. Ray is going to present for about 15 to 20 minutes on the actual findings of the research. Then we will invite all our panelists up to the dais, and we will give all of them a chance to respond. I will be asking a few questions to them, and then we'll open it up to the floor, so you will have a chance to pose your own questions. Without further ado, Ray.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Steiner, and to the Institute here for partnering with us. It's indeed a privilege to be here. So just a word or two to place this study into context. I'm with Cardus. We are a think tank that started in Canada at about 2000. Our focus as a think tank, our mission is the renewal of social architecture. We spend our time focused on the institutions that rest between individuals and government, mapping their contribution to our shared life together. How do the various institutions of society contribute to the public good and social prosperity? That really is the animating question for Cardus. In 2011, we did a first study of private schools in the United States that came out of a particular symposium that we held. These reports, all the reports I'm going to mention, by the way, are available online on our website if you want. That looked at the contribution of the religious school sector in the United States. And our research question in the initial study was, is there an alignment between the motivations and the outcomes of religious schooling? Why are parents choosing that school, and in fact, are the graduates producing results that are in alignment with those objectives? So it was a very different focus, but we used essentially the same survey as we did in this particular report. What we found in the 2011 report was that, in fact, Catholics and Protestants graduates were both achieving the different emphasis that their school administrators and parents were looking for. Catholics were much stronger in academic formation, whereas Protestants were much stronger in spiritual formation. And in fact, that was what both of them were aspiring for. So there was an alignment. You get to some extent what you are looking for. In 2012, we repeated the survey with a Canadian sample. Now, Canadian education is a little bit different, not unlike what was mentioned in the opening in terms of what happens across the pond. Canada was not formed by a revolution, but by a peace treaty, essentially, between French Catholics and English Protestants. And support for religious schooling is written right into our Constitution, Section 93, if you'd like to look it up, which guarantees protection for the religious minority. Now, that was 147 years ago, and a lot has changed to the application of that, and we have quite a mismatch of public policy in our different jurisdictions in terms of what Canadian schools look like. In fact, in Canada, you will find support for religious schools anywhere from 0, very much similar to what you have here, to 70% of the per student's funding, and some religious schools are actually alternative schools within the public system. What that allowed us to do was to look at different models of funding, and in the Canadian data, the lens of analysis we looked at was the purposes of education as outlined in the Education Act. Were graduates of this continuum of schools equally achieving the purposes, the objectives of education as were outlined in the Act? What we found was that private schools, in fact, were exceeding, in most cases, the purposes that were outlined. This project started as a one-off project, but when we had these two studies, it became evident that we had a very significant data set on our hands that no one else was doing. And the net result of that was to say, instead of a one-off project, we actually need to continue investigating the many other questions that this research was opening up. And so last July the 1st, we partnered with the University of Notre Dame and we established the Cardus Religious Schools Initiative, and this is the first data release that is coming from that new project. There is, if you may just want to Google that to come to the webpage, Dr. David Sickink, the director of our initiative, is here with us tonight. He was the principal investigator on this study. We are doing almost every other week or so, there's a new report or analysis of some piece that is coming, and it's all on the website. I'm not going to report on any of that tonight, simply to highlight there is a wealth of material there that is both building on our own data as well as how our data interacts with other initiatives. So, part of what we wanted to do was to say that benchmark that we established in 2011, 2012, if we compare that to a still video, what does a still picture, what does the video look like? What are the trends? Where is this going? And we have committed now to collecting this data every 4 years, so we will collect another sample of US data in 2018. And the intention is to collect another sample of Canadian data in 2016. So every other year there will be a new set of data, sort of like the Summer and Winter Olympics. In terms of the particulars of this data that I'm about to report to you, 1,496 to be precise, respondents, data collected March 2014 from an internet panel. The ages of the respondents were 24 to 39, which meant that they graduated from school in 1993 to 2008. So keep in mind, we're not really looking at schools today. We're looking at schools as they were, and we're evaluating the outcomes. And on all of the graphs, you're going to see two slides, or two bars. The bar on the left is the raw data. The bar on the right is after we have controlled to try to isolate the schooling effect. So we have controlled for 23 social, economic, family, religion, trying to really compare apples and apples in terms of the outcomes. So the report is available. You can download it now. Well, not right now. Wait. You can, but at carduseducationsurvey.com, and by the end of the week, for those who are real keeners, there will be a complete set of slides, approximately 500 in total, that will be on the website by the end of the week, so you can peruse this to your heart's content. Let's get into the findings. What we did in terms of the lens of interpretation this time is we took the Nation at Risk document, which highlights 4 outcomes of education: intellectual, economic, civic, and social. And we added a 5th, religious. Obviously, if you're looking at religious schools, one of the reasons that many have chosen this sector is because there's a sense that that's a component that's important as well. So that's the lens, and I'll try briefly in those 5 categories just to give you a very quick snapshot of the findings. First of all, when it comes to years of education, as you see here, the private non-religious schools and Catholic schools, both are in raw data as well as after a schooling effect. So the blue is the raw data, the green is the schooling effect after we put all of our controls in. Both are achieving more, their graduates are having more years of education than our evangelical Protestants or public schoolers. The 0 line represents the public school respondents. So if the bars are above the line, it means they're more likely than public school graduates. If the bars are below the line, less likely. And that yellow line that you see there is statistical significance. The sociologists will want to do a whole lot more with that. Those of us who aren't into stats, the key thing to take a look at is if that yellow line crosses 0, as it does here for evangelical Protestant, that means that's not a statistically significant finding. So the minute that yellow line is crossing the 0 bar, it means that statistically they're looking like public schoolers on that particular measure. Although, as you see, they are trending very slightly positive, and in some cases, but we don't have the confidence statistically to make that claim. You'll see a theme here. Private non-religious and Catholic schoolers, for the most part, look quite similar on most of the academic metrics, whereas evangelical Protestants, for the most part, look very much like public schoolers. Here we're comparing the number of PhDs versus BAs in terms of, so are you more or less likely to get a PhD and continue your education all the way to that level? Can we? Okay, one of the areas, we did a whole component this time on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math courses. The very quick story of about 30 slides, which I'm going to reduce to just this one, is that when it comes to the number of courses available at the entry level, very similar results right across the board. When it comes to advanced courses like trigonometry, calculus, some of those advanced placement courses, there's a very strong difference between the private non-religious and the Catholic schools and everyone else. It's clear from the STEM results, not only in terms of the inputs, but also in terms of where the graduates end up in terms of choice of major and career. There is something happening in the Catholic and non-religious schools that those of us who are concerned about STEM results can take a look at. There is a distinctive pattern in the results that are quite interesting. We asked a whole series of questions about satisfaction. So we're asking a 24 to 39-year-old, looking back, did your high school prepare you well for, and we asked a whole bunch of questions. On the academic questions, I've chosen the side in terms of university. What you will see consistently, and I think it's an important observation that I'll come back to at the very end. There is a strong satisfaction that graduates attribute to their high school, even when you ask about the specific inputs, there's not a whole lot of difference. So you're seeing, we ask in terms of the STEM courses, much of it looks the same. Yet when you ask satisfaction questions, private schoolers tend to have a more positive evaluation than do their public school counterparts, which is an interesting conclusion. In terms of occupation, there are some definite occupational patterns. Catholic schoolers are far more likely to end up in a career with STEM, professional, managerial. Protestant school graduates, on the other hand, are more likely to end up in humanities and social science type of occupations, education, healthcare, social care. So there is a distinct pattern of employment that does come out that can be differentiated by school sector at statistically significant levels. Right across the board, when it comes to employment, there is no real difference between the sectors. Everyone, as you see, there are some differences in terms of the raw data, but by the time you put the controls in, all of those lines cross zero, and there is no statistical significant difference in terms of the current employment of those. However, when it comes to employment, not only is the area different of employment, the type of job, what is also interesting is that there is a distinct pattern among evangelical Protestants who seem to have a different rubric of decision-making about the career that they choose. They are far more likely to say that they've been called to this line of work. Money, in terms of career, seems much less important in their decision-making. So there is a set of slides that I could show that all seem to point to something different going on in terms of how they make their decision. Moving over from, there is a pattern of findings in terms of a sense of the culture being hostile to them. There's an other out there that comes through in various of the results. So there is something happening there as well. On the other hand, they are givers, they are volunteers. When you look at volunteering in terms of either the religious sector or the non-religious sector, they trend positive, but it's not statistically significant. But remember the fact that all of us have 168 hours in a week, yet the Protestants are significant, the evangelical Protestants are significantly positive on both the religious and the non-religious sector, and if you actually put them together, it's quite clear that they are carrying a significant load of the volunteering that goes on in our community. Willingness to do other political activities, no statistical difference at all. How well did your high school prepare you to interact with culture and society? In retrospect, they look back and they say, yes, the school, all of the school findings of the private schools are in the statistically significant category, so they are reflecting back positively on the preparation that their high school did, again, with the benefit of being 5 to 15 years removed from that. The fourth area on a nation at risk is the social outcomes. Here is some findings that I at least found somewhat surprising. I don't think this is that surprising. We asked all the respondents to give us the names of 4 of the people they were closest to. And then we asked a whole series of questions about those names. So how did you get to know them? What are your relationships with them? It's very interesting when we analyze those ties. There are strong family ties. But I think it's counterintuitive to some when we asked about the ethnic diversity or being a friend with an atheist. A number of those, the nature of the diversity of those relationships, there is no statistical difference between any of the categories. So the idea that to some extent the schools are creating an isolationist effect, when we're actually looking as adults, it would appear that the networks of relationships are as diverse across the board, something I suspect some people may find somewhat counterintuitive. Looking back, how well did your school prepare you for the relationship? Again, very positive evaluation of the school. Very quickly, in the final area, the religious outcomes. I've already mentioned it's quite clear that there are strong outcomes for evangelical Protestants. This confirms what we found in 2011. Similarly, in terms of their obligations in carrying out of religious practices, short-term mission trips, although again, that seems to be a little more of a family than a school effect. How well did the school prepare you religiously? There's obviously a very positive impact. One thing that may be as surprising is not the Catholic and the evangelical, but I'm only going to show one slide here, but there's a whole series of slides in the deck in which non-religious academic schools tend to have much more positive evaluation of the religious preparation than do the public schools. Both are secular on paper, and yet there is a very different pattern that is happening there that certainly merits some here's another example, the way your school handled religious matters. So, what can we say about all of this? Very quickly in summary, Catholic schools are very good at the intellectual, economic. The results would suggest that they're contributing to social mobility. Protestants, the strengths clearly, religious formation, civic engagement, weaker on the academic side, and hence some of the professional options and where they're ending up. You're seeing the consequences of that. Jewish and Islamic schools, we did not have an adequate sample size to pull those numbers out and to look at them. However, we surmise in the report, based on what we have, is that they lie somewhere between evangelical and Catholic schools in terms of the outcomes. But we don't have statistically, our numbers of those are not large enough for us to do that. It's certainly an area that needs further research. Charter schools is a growing segment of today's makeup of the student population. That said, the movement is too young for us really to be able to capture it using this methodology. So I would suspect 4 years from now, we'll probably have enough charter school graduate numbers to be able to look at it. We suspect they look a little more like the private sector in creating a strong school culture. Private non-religious, very good at social integration. They have a very high percentage of non-citizens. Their religious outcomes are a bit surprising as well. We did collect a sample of homeschools, and there are lots of interesting results there, but they're very different than everything else. So we've pulled them out of this report, and we'll give a separate report in a few months' time. And then you have the public or the traditional schools. Whenever you make a presentation like this, because we use that as the comparison line, we tend to talk about how everyone is different, and one wants to say the assumption is different equals better, and that's not always the case. I think it's important to highlight here, on 500 or so slides, on about 350 to 400, there is no statistical difference between private schools and public schools, which also speaks commendingly to much that's going on in that sector. And I think the learning has to go both ways as we face our educational challenges together. Let me leave you with 4 ponderings. I would suggest that we're engaged in a common educational purpose, whether we're in public schools or private schools, and that there is an opportunity for innovation and learning. I don't think when we take a look at our international results, whether it's in Canada or the United States, that we're happy in terms of where it is. There's room for improvement, and I think there's lots of opportunity for innovation and learning. I think the entire results in terms of cultivating social capital, as we're concerned about social mobility and people moving up the ladder, I think there's some very interesting findings here that have some implications. I can't help but reflect on the fact that when graduates evaluate their own school experience, they do so very positively, even though the ingredients don't seem to point to that much difference. So is there something here in which the total is more than the sum of its parts? You can download the program or the entire study at carduseducationsurvey.com, and I thank you for your attention.
So thank you so much. And after Ray's remarks, we're going to go straight into discussion. Remember, we will get to questions from the audience at the end. I'm going to start by asking each of the panelists to react to the data and to the remarks for 5 to 6 minutes. And perhaps we can start on my right with Kathy. So please.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Is this on?
Is it on?
Maybe I'm loud enough to not need it anyway.
It is.
I'd like to thank Hunter College and CUNY and Cardus for having me here and sharing this wonderful data. As I was reading the report, I definitely saw a lot of similarities with what is existing in Islamic schools today. Islamic schools, generally speaking, are quite young, and we don't have a lot of graduates out there that we can pull information and see how much they are affecting the civic engagement part. However, again, reading the data, I was torn between the evangelical Protestant and the Catholic data, because I felt like there was major parts that, well, yeah, we're just like the Catholics, and then there was a major part we're just like the Protestants, and then we were like, well, the private non-religious schools, there were some aspects as well. So I think that's very telling of our communities in general. Islamic schools are new for a particular reason. At least in my perspective, Muslims have been in America for quite some time. It's not like they just came. My father, for example, came in the 50s. When they migrated to the United States, there wasn't a desperate need to open up schools, all right, because they had the knowledge, and it was a requirement for the parents to educate their children. So you see a lot of weekend schools, very similar to the weekend schools or Sunday schools and other faith traditions. And that held up for a while. But the second generation coming through realized that we weren't passing down the knowledge and the outward acts of worship as our parents had. And so there was this need to ensure that there was this identity being passed on. So I want to say about 35 years is about the oldest school that I'm aware of. There is that Nation of Islam movement that in the 60s opened up a few schools that the Sister Clara Muhammad schools have now became Sunni Muslim. But generally speaking, our schools are relatively young. Now with that said, the Islamic School League of America tries to collect data across the country to see where our graduates are going. And our schools are very, very diverse. And I can give you an example of when, as a principal of an Islamic school, I'd get phone calls from a classroom parent who would be very frustrated about how much homework we were sending home with the kids. And in that same classroom, I'd have a parent call me and say, "Why aren't you giving enough homework for my kid?" So that tells me a few things. One, a lot of our immigrant parents have a very high standard for education. In terms of the STEM, if our parents are doctors and engineers in the medical field, then that was something they pushed their children. And those are the parents that were calling me about not getting enough homework. And for the others that were mostly second-generation Americans, they're a little bit more lax about the homework. And generally speaking, you're like, well, you can go into the social service sectors and you can go into other sectors, just more arts and culture and that type of thing. So our schools are very diverse within our buildings. But one common trend that we are seeing is that the schools themselves are based in a community that describes the culture of that school. And that has a big impact on civic engagement. Some schools in more affluent communities, for example, where finances are not necessarily an issue, will focus a lot on the STEM. You'll see a lot of engineers and doctors coming out of those schools. However, in other areas where the funding may not be as luxurious, if you will, for example, here in the city, we have quite a few Islamic schools in New York City. But the perspective from parents is very different. They don't see Islamic schools in the city, perhaps, as I'm going to send my child to this school and it's going to be academically excellent. It's going to push my child. It's more like the evangelical Protestant perspective. It's going to be very spiritual for them. So a lot of the schools are very dictated by the communities that these schools are established under. I wanted to point out that while we were going back and forth between the push for the academics and then the push for the spirituality, our school logo is spiritual and academic excellence. And I guess we're greedy, we want both. And our parents hold on to that. A lot of our schools are new, but a lot of our schools are accredited. One of the first things we do when we open up a school is get that accreditation, because we want to make sure that our parents feel that our schools are meeting a high standard and that their children will succeed. And in our view, it's to succeed in this life and the afterlife from a spiritual perspective. In order to do that, we've got to give them the best of both. So the spiritual aspect is intended to bring out from within a child that academic excellence. And that's supposed to go hand in hand. Whether we're successful at that is still questionable. We're still working on it.
Great, thank you. Sean.
Thanks, David. Hi, I'm Sean Corcoran. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So I'm an economist at NYU, the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. I'm a little bit out of my element because I don't actually do much work on private versus public school comparisons. But I can say that this is one of the classic questions in the economics of education is really trying to understand the impact of attending a private school versus a public school. And this is a question that's almost fallen out of favor in the last 10 years or so with the rise of charter schools and other alternatives to public schools, where kind of all of the action is. And that's a point I'm actually going to return to at the end of my comments. But First, I wanted to applaud the authors of the study for asking a lot of the right questions. There's so much in this report to think about, lots of really interesting questions asked of these survey respondents that just aren't covered anywhere else. Historically, so much of the focus on this research I mentioned on differences between private and public school attendance is focused very much on academic achievement. So just differences in test scores between kids who attend public schools versus private schools. And now you're seeing that with charter schools as well. While these are clearly important measures, I think what we're learning now is that schools that may appear to differ very little in terms of academic achievement can look very different when it comes to long-run life outcomes. So things such as educational attainment, attending and completing college, teen pregnancy, incarceration, and even just simple things like life satisfaction. So this study is really an impressive attempt to capture systematically some of these long-run factors that are just missed when we focused purely on test score differences between schools. So that said, I'm also going to put my stats hat on. Ray mentioned the stats folks that like to get in to the more nitty-gritty of the study, and I'd like to do that just for a second. And so I would like to urge caution a little bit to the authors in using phrases like the schooling effect or the impact of schools on these outcomes. And so in my profession and certainly in my classroom with my own students, we set a really high bar for inferring impact on certain outcomes. And in order to interpret differences in outcomes as an impact, you have to be pretty confident that the other factors that explain differences in outcomes are being held constant and are being accounted for. And authors of this report do a really impressive job of collecting a lot of other data and using those as controls in order to account for those differences. But I would just press them to say that there still are some serious unobserved differences in the kinds of families that choose to attend an evangelical Protestant church or a Catholic school, versus a public school. And so that's going to, in part, explain some of the differences that we see. And it's hard to know really how much of that difference is explained by those unobserved factors. But it is helpful to think about kind of the direction of the bias, like if we're omitting something, what difference might that make in our interpretation of the results? Certainly when it comes to outcomes like educational attainment, we often see that those effects are larger or actually smaller than they appear in the raw differences, because once you account for those differences in who goes to those schools, the difference gets much smaller. It's harder to know what that would look like for the non-academic social factors, so like civic participation, for example. So what you saw in the slides was that there were actually very little differences between sectors in kids' social attitudes and civic engagement. And that made me think, well, so what direction might this be biased? I might expect those students to be better off in that dimension, just given the differences in kinds of families that attend these schools. And so is it the fact that maybe that difference is actually understated there? A couple of other little points on the same topic. I would love, there's already, I don't know how many hundred figures in the report, which are wonderful, but I would actually love to see what those differences are in those base characteristics of graduates of public schools versus religious schools. I was actually shocked by how little difference they made in those bar charts. So you saw that there was the raw difference and then the adjusted difference when they were often really not that different. And in one of my class exercises, we actually do this. We compare the test scores of private school and public school students, and we see a huge difference in the average. But then once you control for things like income or parental education, that shrinks. And like it may still be positive, but it's much smaller. And I don't see those kind of changes here, which is, it just puzzled me and made me wonder why such homogeneous results. Maybe it's a function of who's responding to the sample. So I'm probably running out of time. So let me just skip to some long-run things to think about. So things that aren't really covered in the topic in the report, but things we'd love to see more of in the future. So one is this issue of the rise of charter schools and other alternatives to public schools, and the question of how this is going to affect the kinds of results that we see in this report, as well as just the private school sector in general. So here we're seeing a lot of homogeneity across sectors, but is it the case that as families who once considered private schools as an alternative to public schools that they weren't satisfied with find their way now to charter schools and other alternatives, that private schools may become more and more of a niche element, such that Catholic schools will actually start to look more like the evangelical Protestant schools, because it's serving a different purpose than it has in the past. The kinds of public policy supports for private schools that there have been in the past, things like vouchers and tuition tax credits. Now that all these public school alternatives are available, will that public support for those supports for private schools dry up? That's really an unanswered question. Lastly, there's a lot of focus in the report on differences between these groups. I'd like to know what the overall, and I'm sure they're in there somewhere in the report, but I'd like to know what the overall level of some of these variables are, like civic engagement. So there's not very much difference in civic engagement, but is that because the school sectors are doing an equally bad job of getting our kids prepared for civic life? So I'd love to see more of a focus on just overall how are these sectors doing.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you. Ashley?
Okay. So thank you all for coming. I'm also the deputy director of this institute. But tonight I wanted to limit my comments to discussing how this kind of research affects our policy conversations at state and national level in a time of a shifting educational landscape. So 200 years ago, our public schools were pluralistic. Many towns and municipalities would provide Protestant, Catholic, sometimes Jewish schools, depending on the population. And this continued well into the third quarter of the 19th century. And for various historical and cultural reasons, some noble, some not so noble, our notion of public school became more uniform. And so we went from being more plural to being more uniform, and our notion of the traditional public common school entered the cultural imagination. It's the uniformity. And I think in the past few decades, we've seen a growing pluralism in our educational landscape. As Sean mentioned, on the public side, we have charters, we have inter-district choice models, we have online schools, Florida virtual schools, and then these various tax credit and voucher programs allow mostly low-income families to access the private school sector. So there is even more attention being paid to these sector differences. Before I talk about the report itself and its impact, just to note that other liberal democracies have, as David and Ray both mentioned, are much more pluralistic than ours. So a few examples. The Netherlands, which has been a secular nation since the 18th century, funds 36 different types of schools on equal footing. Different kinds of Jewish schools, different kinds of Christian schools, different kinds of pedagogical schools, and so on. England has been funding plural education since 1834 and have, as the population has changed, expanded the kinds of schools that are funded. They provide 85% of the capital costs of a new school. Everyone in here is gulping, right? And 100% of the operating costs. So a small example, the Jewish community. 20 years ago, only 12% of Jewish kids attended Jewish day schools in the UK. It is now over 70%. So, and with government support, the kinds of schools that are being funded is expanding as well. Just a few more examples. Denmark funds between 75 and 85% of the cost of different kinds of schools. Luxembourg funds 90%. 22% of Italy's schools are non-state run. They're state funded, but not state operated. And I could go on and on and on, but I have to mention Canada, in which, in Alberta, which funds many different kinds of schools, they offer a stipend for homeschooling. So I think the point is, as our educational landscape is shifting, we're gradually moving towards what other liberal democracies already do. And as such, we can learn from them both strengths and weaknesses, guidance, and cautionary tales. So my larger comment is that this kind of research offers both reassurance and also a challenge as we change some of the state models that we have. So there's reassurance, I think, in that our big concern is, can non-public schools create citizens? And it looks like, from this data and from many, many, many other research models, that non-public schools have a lot to offer in the areas that we care about, whether it's academics or civic formation or social capital. I'm just going to read from Bill Galston, who worked in the Clinton White House, and he's a political scientist at Brookings. He wrote this in 2001. He describes the research on civic formation, which points towards the benefits of all different kinds of schools. Quotation, "If future research confirms these positive results, we will be compelled to rethink some long-held beliefs about sources of civic unity in the United States, and to reflect anew on the relationship between the ethos of individual schools and the civic purposes of education." So that was in 2001. I would submit that this reevaluation is going on constantly now. But I think this kind of research also offers a challenge, because it gestures towards the fact that just as in a plural society in general, that pluralization of education will necessarily bring some new tensions. It may solve some problems, it will create others. So from the report and also larger conversations that are happening, these are a few examples. So evangelical Protestants have a lower educational attainment, right? And this is changing within the evangelical Protestant sector. There are many groups that are trying to improve the credentialing and so on. But nevertheless, the fact that there are these differences suggests, as such schools become funded, what do we ask of them accountability-wise and academically? Homeschooling. Are we concerned about the less socially positive results, and what do we do about it? There are other models elsewhere that can speak to this. But all kinds of issues will come up. Creationism versus evolution, same-sex orientation, funding, how do you make an equitable funding scenario? So that's the first challenge. The second challenge, I think, is can we have these conversations and avoid being locked into a superiority comparison model? So, many countries that have plural education will not do this kind of sector comparison, because the point is not which is better, the point is, are they different? And I think that's important to bear in mind. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm going to push back briefly on each of the speakers. That's my role. Starting with our presenter. Is the takeaway just that we shouldn't be worried because we're universally mediocre in the United States? And, frankly, who cares? Mediocre Catholic, mediocre Protestant, mediocre public. Or is it exciting that the results here suggest that the academics are stronger, at least in a number of the sectors, that the civic engagement is a little better than the average public school graduate? In other words, what's the takeaway here? Am I supposed to embrace the Dutch model like crazy because it's exciting, or am I just supposed to say, yikes, it's just pretty awful everywhere in the United States. We don't have anything that's shooting at the moon. I mean, even the Catholic results aren't exactly, off the chart stellar. They're not telling us there's a sector there that's outstanding. So what am I taking away here?
As I attempted to in my conclusion, I think it's very important not to establish the superiority in terms of saying, here's the answer. I don't think any one sector here provides the answer. I think if we looked at any other area of society, and if we had a problem, where does innovation come from? Where does learning come from? And I would suspect that for most North Americans, and it's true even though we're a bit different in Canada, I don't think it's that different. When we say education, we immediately think it's a synonym for public education. Mm-hmm. And what happens here is something else on the fringes. And I would encourage us to think of that complete pie chart of all of the different sectors of education, begin our research and analysis to say, we're in this together, what can we learn from each other, how are different sectors, what are they doing well, and overcome the monopoly mindset that somehow one school system is the equivalent of public education. I think all of these are contributing in their own way with their own strengths and weaknesses to the common good. And if, in fact, we're going to see the changes that get us away from being universally mediocre to aspiring to something higher, then I think we actually need to look at a multi-sector approach.
Okay. Turning to you, Kathy, you made a very provocative point that the economics of the school community has a direct relationship to the demands academically of the parents, and I think you implied, I want to ask you about this, that actually has an impact on the sort of academic standards of the school, which I think is a very honest statement and would actually be true of all the sectors, I suspect, though I'm speculating. Do you feel that the models you're looking at in your sector enable you at all to equalize the economic demographics of your students? How are you seeing that? Or are you caught, as so many of us are in the public sector, with zip code determinism, as I would put it?
Well, again, as I said earlier, our schools are socioeconomically also diverse.
Yes.
And so ideally, you know, based on the faith, we try to ensure that we're including a very diverse population in our buildings. However, clearly those who have more are able to send their children with less. And so we have school vouchers, we have the Children's Scholarship Fund, for example, that assists us in that calling and bringing students who not necessarily would have the funding to attend private schools. And that helps us kind of maintain a diversity within our buildings. And with that said, then we can kind of merge and find this place where we are spiritually and academically. Now, there are states that do not have vouchers, and so they don't have that luxury perhaps, and they are more focused on a specific socioeconomic level. However, again, ideally, based on the faith itself, those are things that we're supposed to be avoiding. We are supposed to be pulling children from all backgrounds and giving them the opportunity to learn in such an environment. So we're working on trying to ensure that everyone has that opportunity, depending on where our schools are located and whether states are offering scholarship funds for our students or tax credits. You will see, for example, in Florida, they have the tax credits. So our schools are very diverse in Florida within each building, and that gives us a model of what Islam is supposed to be like. It's supposed to cater to all. And so in those areas, we'll find more success in that regards, as opposed to states that don't offer those.
So public funding turns out to be critical.
Absolutely, yeah.
Interesting. Sean, we've known each other for a while, and you're being terribly polite this evening, much to my disappointment. Look, you're dealing with data from surveys. You're dealing not only with data from surveys, but internet surveys. You're dealing with claims from that data that can only be correlational at best, based on the regression analysis. Is there really any reason to take this data seriously?
It's like throwing meat to the... No. Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, it's a very...
No, it's not.
it's a very provocative report. I mean, I think one of the marks of an interesting study is the kind of questions that it raises. And I attended a roundtable on this report this afternoon, and was just impressed by the number of questions that the report prompted. They wanted to see this and that, and I think it really... it brought attention to data that just is not available other places. There are certain limitations to where this data came from. It was an internet-based survey. It's not clear it's representative of the population of graduates from these sectors. But I think it's a good start, and I hope it attracts the attention that it deserves, and then also prompts further, say, more rigorous studies around the development of things like civic engagement. Over the long run. I would love to see a longitudinal study interviewing students as they come into high school, and then 5 years later or 10 years later. It's very expensive, but you can have a lot of faith in the kinds of results that you get from those studies. So,
so not to be dismissed.
Not to be dismissed.
Excellent. A relief. Ashley, there's a normative thesis behind your remarks, I think, which is somehow that if the United States embraced a pluralistic model a la Holland, it would be a really good thing for the country, presumably the assumption being that academic outcomes would rise. As we go through the countries you listed, we see very different academic outcomes. I mean, you could do a scatter diagram on PISA. So clearly, just pluralism isn't going to give you nirvana. Shouldn't we kind of climb off the high horse and just acknowledge that maybe it's a nice thing, but it really has little to do with academic outcomes?
I agree that structural pluralism does not equal academic or civic accomplishment. I mean, you may be able to correlate in some cases, but there's a lot more going on in a school. So many of the countries that have a more plural structure have a more rigorous academic content that's enforced, right? So the Netherlands, they have these 36 different kinds of schools, and they have requirements of curriculum and so forth. That, I guess my basic answer to your question is, you're right. Structural pluralism does not guarantee a certain outcome. What it does is it creates a certain kind of space. And that space can be used well. It can be used where the curriculum comes in. That's where the culture of teaching comes in. And frankly, structural pluralism can be created in a way that works against equity. It can be created in a way that works for it. And we also have examples around the world for that.
So let me pose one general question to any who want to answer. One thing the report didn't really speak about was curriculum in depth. There was some reference to the number of higher level math and science courses taken. But the old understanding of why Catholic schools did better, apart from the fact that you were occasionally paddled, which I was too, so I'm all in favor of it, except that in England they used willow canes, which were more painful, I'm told. But apart from the discipline structures at Catholic schools, they also actually believe in a rather deep and rich curriculum, subject curriculum. I had the honor of reviewing a manuscript recently from a rather well-known educational scholar who's going to make a very powerful argument that this country's shift from content-rich to skills-based curriculum has been a catastrophe. Is it not the sort of elephant in the room that the differences here are really best explained by what you happen to study? And when you study rich, demanding stuff, you do better? Yeah. I mean, that's the question. I mean, are we just missing the main argument here? It's a question. Are we missing the main argument here?
I wouldn't want to claim anything more than the study in terms of, this is not a comprehensive study of all aspects of education. As a matter of fact, when we began in terms of the design, we looked at surveying students as well and weighed the merits within the resources available of the benefits of graduates and students. I think one of the reasons we went for this model was it looked at outcomes somewhat years later as opposed to an assessment. You could actually evaluate real behavior,
right,
rather than attitudes or opinions about it at the time. But you know, this is an opening to an area that's under-researched, and certainly, you know, speaking personally, just in terms of the choices my wife and I have made in terms of our own, I would agree in terms of curriculum, a recovery of the liberal arts. That sort of focus, I think, has everything to do with exciting the imagination and understanding what the good life and what prosperity might be. And maybe, you know, I posit as not out of this, but just in terms of conversation, is it because there is a clearer defined sense of purpose within these communities that leads to these positive evaluations when the students look back because there's something they can grab onto, and there's something more articulate that they either like or don't like? But it's much more articulate than sort of the vanilla antiseptic thing that sometimes we see in public education.
As you go about curriculum design, how are you answering this question?
Well, I'm looking, when I think of curriculum, I think of two things.
Please.
Hidden curriculum, which as educators, we know hidden curriculum is the overall school culture. And studies show that 75 to 80% of what children learn in school is the hidden curriculum. You know, how things are happening in the building. And I think our faith-based schools do a specific role, they have a specific role in that regards, and that what we emphasize in our school culture is something that we hope will be carried on with the students and determine whether they're going to be civically engaged or the types of fields of study or jobs they go into. Now, the actual content-based curriculum, in our schools, we are always trying to buy in parents. We're always trying to show the parents that we could do this. We can get your kids to understand, and a lot of our schools just jump right into now it's the Common Core, and we're right there with them with the Common Core. And in New York State, we have these wonderful modules, and we're trying to fit these New York State modules with the Common Core with what we believe in, and we're trying to mesh it all together, and it's this ongoing process. You know, we say the curriculum is never done, and we're constantly trying to make sure that our students are getting the same type, if not better, of the content aspect of what students are getting in the public school sector. But for us, our focus really, really is focused on the hidden curriculum that we know the children are really absorbing.
Any thoughts on this one or change?
No.
Yep. Let me shift to an economist question. If the outcomes academically are largely indistinguishable, is there a conclusion to be drawn from, for example, the double penalty on families who have to pay their real estate taxes for the public school and then have to pay for the private school? I mean, what do we derive from this as an economist looking at these results?
So you're almost saying, is it worth it?
Yes.
I mean, that's one nice thing, I guess, about the choice of public versus private schools is that it's a choice. Same within the public sector. And so I think the more that families know about what they can get from one choice versus another, the more likely they will be to make a sensible choice that's right for them. And so I think, test scores may be the same whether on average, if you attend a Catholic school versus a traditional public school. But if that school provides other outcomes that wouldn't have been available in the public school, then I think that's great. And there's also the matching factor too. So I guess there are there's a student school match going on, and so there may be students for whom a particular type of school is the right one.
Let me ask it differently. I think I phrased it poorly. If the results are the same, is there any justification for not publicly funding private schools economically?
I may have to get back to you that.
I mean, that's obviously another elephant in the room, right? Yes.
I mean, I can say something briefly about that. The studies that I've seen suggest that as far as money going from the public sector to the private sector through vouchers, as long as the amount that's taken does not exceed the variable costs of the schools as opposed to the fixed costs, that there's no damage to the public sector. So I think that's important to bear in mind as well.
I think
that's not the larger question, though.
No, the larger question is simply if the academic outcomes are the same and if the social outcomes are at least as good. And if the old fear is that religious schools are creating citizens who dislike each other more intensely, which turns out to not be true, or have deficient characteristics of civic engagement, which turns out not to be true. In other words, if our worries are for naught, then why are we penalizing families financially who want to send their child to a religious school? That I think, is an open question. All right, I see lots and lots of anxious questions in the audience. I will get to everybody. Let's start at the back. And could you just give your name?
Sure. Father Peter Stravinskas with the Catholic Education Foundation. Two questions for Mr. Penning about contrast, let's say. It seems to me, and maybe you've discovered this in the survey, that the Catholic school system, if you will, is much more like a public system than the evangelical, in the sense that we sort of take everybody who comes in, whereas the evangelical, at least in my experience, seems to be much more self-selective. A much more committed parent would choose an evangelical school than a less committed evangelical. And then the second question is the comparison or better contrast between Catholic school results in the United States versus Canada. And would you suggest that the difference is that in the States, the Catholic schools are much, much more conscious of Catholic identity and have much more control over that factor than they do in Canada?
Please.
Yes. In terms of your first question, in terms of selection, in our 2011 report, in the introduction, we go through some of the history in terms of Protestant and Catholic schools, and your point is very well. Many Catholic schools have a long history of almost inner city ministry and bringing people in and serving others, as opposed to Protestant schools, which obviously are diverse, both sectors are diverse, but Protestant schools by and large have been sort of a response to concerns in the public education system and and are much more recent. I think one of the challenges we have, while we focus on schooling effect and we attempt through the 23 categories, I don't think you can disaggregate family and school. I think it's a certain type of family that chooses a school, and there's a whole lot more going on than just the school effect. So to credit the school with everything else that caused the family to choose the school in the very first place is not really entirely fair. That said, I don't think from a research methodological point of view, you can entirely disaggregate this stuff. So you observe the correlations and you put your qualifications on and try to modify your claims so that they're a little more modest. But there is, so I take your point, and I think there is a validity between the self-selection and the nature of the families that are there. And when I was growing up, it was sort of this, the triangle between home, church, and school, and the interaction effects, and you can't pull any one of them out, and I think there's certainly something there. Your second question, Canada's very interesting in that some of our jurisdictions, Ontario being the largest, for example, continues to have a fully funded Catholic system alongside a fully funded private system. Interestingly, there are some Catholic parents who choose to pay tuition and set up their own Catholic school, notwithstanding the public funding system, largely because they don't find the public-funded Catholic school Catholic enough. And it's very interesting to note in our data in 2012, I believe we did 111 correlations, and we could not find a single statistical difference between the graduate of a fully funded Catholic school and a fully funded public school. They looked identical on 111 different measures.
Fascinating.
On the other hand, we have some Catholic schools across the country in which it is not 100% funded. They're funded in the same models, Alberta and BC, Manitoba, where you've got parents paying some form of tuition. So we disaggregated that data, and there was a more Catholic effect when parents were actually paying some part of the tuition as opposed to having it entirely free. So I think both that data speaks very much to your point as well.
Go ahead, and then you want to. Yep.
Yes, Andy Sternberg. So how do you jive the research of Lubienski and Lubienski with your research in that it really showed, after controlling for whatever, that there was a public school advantage as opposed to a Catholic?
You mean academically?
Academically, yes. It did not get into the social and the civic things. So, I mean, it's clearly contrasted. I think, Sean, you alluded to that, but that research was pretty clear.
Right. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, yeah, it's a different age.
Introduce yourself.
For one thing, I mean, they're right. I mean, the studies done from kindergarten through, what is it now, 10th grade or so? So, what happens after that, we don't really know from their study. We've looked at the same data, and what we see in the younger years, and I think others have brought this out, is that in terms of reading, the evangelical Protestant schools do pretty well, but not so well in math and science, which is kind of interesting because you could imagine an argument, a theory in which evangelical Protestant schools would be particularly concerned about reading. So it's an interesting study, but I think we're looking at, different time frames, would be my first.
Thank you. Eugene Fallick. There are a couple of things that I don't understand about the study. And of course, I haven't seen it before. But I wonder, first of all, is there a Lake Wobegon effect in this self-evaluation? You understand what Lake Wobegon is? Okay, number one. Number two, how similar are similarly labeled schools in the US and Canada? And you started out talking about Protestant schools, and then you talked about evangelical schools. And particularly, I think, in Protestant schools, we have two different types of schools. We have, St. Paul's School in New York, which is, I think most of us would call a typical academic institution. And then we have the segregation academies down south. They may not call themselves that, but they were not established for the purpose of education. And I think they're two very different systems, and is it fair for you to put them together under a similar label?
One more, maybe?
And, well, but along the same question, some external measures I think would be much more useful. Number of PhDs, number of elected officials. If someone went into the humanities, did they go into the business of furthering their political ideology, or did they go into general social welfare?
Good, thank you.
Very quickly, no matter how you divide any categories, obviously to have statistical power, you need to bring some people together, or else you can't make these sorts of conclusions. And within every category, there is a diversity and a range, and of those. So we did, in terms of the evangelical Protestants, the reason that it's labeled evangelical Protestants is there was a very small group of respondents that would be mainstream, or mainline Protestants. We pulled them out separate, but they're too small of a group to have statistical power to do the evaluation of themselves. So in terms of that group, we got the name of every school, and we looked up the school and did the categorization of it according to a set of criteria. No criteria is perfect. All of that is inclusive, and I'm not claiming more for it than it is. It's just being transparent, and you do the best with what you have. In terms of the effect of the Lake Wobegon effect that you talked about, I think to some extent by virtue of measuring behaviors afterwards as opposed to trying to focus on attitudes and beliefs, I think we overcome. We actually tried to measure your civic engagement not by what you said about politics, but did you vote in the last election? Do you donate? Do you volunteer? What sort of groups? Same on the social metrics. Give us the name of 4 friends. Now tell us about Joe, Mary, Sam, and be very concrete. So we didn't ask attitude questions. We tried to ask very specific, concrete behavior questions, and we asked the same questions of all categories. Every study has its limits, and I'll be very transparent in terms of I'm not trying to claim more, but I do think that in an area in which there's absolutely nothing, I think this provides some powerful fodder for discussion and debate that's not happening, and that's what we were trying to do.
We're going to bring the mic.
There it is.
There you go.
My name is Jeff Guin. I'm a postdoc at UVA. I went to Catholic schools. My first book's about evangelicals and Muslims, and my second book's about public schools. So I feel relatively comfortable in this conversation. And I guess what my big criticism is, I think we're being very pluralist about means, but not at all pluralist about ends. I mean, we have a kind of remarkably circumscribed vision of the good life here, SES and college degree. I think if you look around this neighborhood, you'll find lots of unhappy people with high SES and lots of degrees. And so, I think for a real robust vision of pluralism, you need to have pluralism of ends, or you have what Charles Taylor called different kinds of food and the same kinds of people. And I think we need to think really hard about evangelicals, and Martha Nussbaum's stuff on capabilities is helpful here. A more interesting question would not be did they get PhDs, but were PhDs important for them, and did they have the capabilities to get them but simply chose not to? Did they have the capability to get high SES but chose jobs that didn't have high SES because, lo and behold, some people don't care as much about money as other people do because their vision of the good is different. And so I think the really important thing that I would push us on here is to actually take pluralism seriously and recognize there are multiple visions of the good.
It's interesting because I thought, I'll just be open about this, I thought your report did better on that than anything else I've seen, just to be complimentary for a change. I mean, and I want you to speak for yourself, but it struck me that they did look at things such as dedicating your career to things other than money, for example, which is quite rare in the research. So we can always ask for more, and that's an entirely legitimate thing, but I would like your comment.
And if I can just pick up on the PhD, I think there are a couple of what are the aspirations of those, are some of the academic differences attributed to different aspirations, and I think you're seeing some of that in terms of the university selection, not necessarily aspiring to the Carnegie Research University, but going to a faith-based, obviously some of them are going to faith-based universities. One other interesting piece of data I did not show, but it's in the slides, is that you have a lot, in terms of the finishing with high school as opposed to going to secondary, you actually have more of evangelical Protestants who are doing, but there's a significant gender difference, and it's not what most expect. Evangelical Protestant women are going on more, and many more men are involved in trades, are going into trade occupations, and also entrepreneurial sort of occupations. So there is a gender difference, but it's not as if the women aren't getting the degrees. The women are actually the ones who are going on more so than the men, and that's at a statistically significant level.
That's probably true in the other sectors too. Like women are beating men across the board.
Mm-hmm. And could I just say something really quickly to Jeff's question about pluralization? I think one of the really interesting things about a more plural educational system is that it does enable you to ask the question, what is the good life, and how do we construe that differently? And so you have, on the one hand, a wide variety in a plural culture of answers to that question, and at the same time, if you have an educational system for the common good, there have to be some norms and some expectations. And I think that's the balance that is so tricky, and to which we can look for many other countries for guidance here.
At the back, two of you, either one.
Softball, maybe not a softball. So is pluralism, so let me give an anecdote. So I just grew up in like the worst part of Baltimore and got a scholarship to this really hoity-toity private school and went to the Ivy League and have had this great thing, and I'm happy.
We're delighted.
Right, so I have that on the one side, and on the other side, I'm on the board of success. So in looking at these two instances, like both very close to me, is pluralism as an engine for new school creation in and of itself enough? Regardless of any of the other positives or negatives that may be a byproduct of it.
Should I answer that? I'm obviously a big advocate for pluralism, but I would always say under certain circumstances. So for example, Chile had one of the world's first voucher systems, and they didn't put any kind of economic restrictions on their voucher programs, and so very upper middle class and wealthy families selected those schools, and the public sector really suffered for it. Whereas when Sweden changed to a per capita funding mechanism, they ensured that there be no academic selectivity in these schools, which is a proxy for middle class concerted cultivation and all of this thing. So I really think, first of all, I don't think pluralization will solve all of our educational problems. I think it's, under certain circumstances, yes.
There's an implicit deal under the table here, which is if the private schools will accept public exams, right, then they can take public money. The problem is, and I'm wearing my old hat as commissioner, the public exams aren't very good. And so that deal is rather suspect, right? We would have to have much better assessments, I would think, to be comfortable about that swap. Yep. All the way at the back.
I guess I'm not even sure if this is a question or more comment about this idea about civic engagement. I think it's really interesting in this context where we look at the improvement and development of our public schools as a social justice issue. And so I guess maybe thinking about when we look at those who are private school and independent school educated, whether that's in kind of the religious context or not, is part of their idea of civic engagement returning back into our public school systems and making them stronger so that in general, like we're not even having this conversation about pluralism, we're having this conversation about overall improvement of education for our country. So I don't know if that's a comment or a question, but that was what came to mind in listening.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Let me just say good question, by the way.
Marisa Zalabek, National School Climate Center. My question is very similar. Basically what do we consider to be educational success? And when I came to this tonight, I was thinking about the idea of what are private schools actually good for America. There are a couple of things I keep feeling that come to mind, which is that the pinnacle, what's considered the pinnacle, are private schools, right? Private elite schools. And that even in the public sector in New York City, certainly at those schools that I know, the model for what is successful in an elite public school is directly modeled off of a private school. And the two things that you need for that, it was interesting. I was first going to say resources, but the bigger than financial resources is actually family involvement. And family involvement is one of two things. It can be just parents who can't even help deal with their kids in the school, but they got them there. And for a lot of wealthy parents, it's parents who actually hire somebody to do it for them. And so what is the goal of education, what is citizenship, and what is the model? And the thing is where it really comes to roost in the lifelong sense to me. And maybe this is a question for Mr. Pennings, is the recent articles that have been constant about, and a panic, since I have a high school child and deal with high school children all the time, is that they are in a panic that if they go to a state school, they will never get into, that they've been told, you know, it's okay if you can't afford, yes, if you can't afford it, if you can get into a state school, don't do it, because you're not going to get into a master's program or a PhD down the line that's in an elite school. And if you don't get that elite school, I mean, everybody I think here has probably read those articles. Anyway, those are the questions.
Do you want me to? I would say very quickly, it's important, you know, we're focused on education, and there's, you know, obviously this is an education institute and focus. I would put on my Cardus hat to talk about social architecture and the reality. I think we have defaulted so much in our society as if there is sort of just two ways of thinking about things, sort of public equals through government and that which we do together, and private equals individual choice and markets determining. And I think we have lost the important and normative role of various other institutions like family, like church, like school, like community association. And I think it's putting education not just, you know, to talk about something, obviously we narrowly focus on it, but actually I think to understand it in terms of its interaction with all of these other spheres. And in a very limited way, I think the range of questions that we tried to ask in terms of the involvements and engagements in terms of outcomes got at that, but you're quite right in terms of the inputs of what's going on. You know, we not only didn't look at curriculum, we didn't look at, you know, there's a limit to what you can do, but I think there's a complex interplay of various social institutions that are contributing to this that go well beyond an educational conversation.
So let me begin to summarize and thank, because I want to emphasize beyond the few pressing questions I tried to pose, that this kind of work is quite rare, and that we are not a society in this country that asks a lot of really sophisticated questions about educational outcomes. We tend to do a lot of reduction of these issues into simple-minded binary conversations, public, private, as you say, or walls of separation, or whatever other binary you can think of. And I think opening up these questions is just a mature and vital part of civic discourse, and it's something that I think we need far, far more of. We need to try to get beyond some of these zero-sum games that really do dominate so much of educational debate. And I think you and your colleagues are really to be congratulated on helping us to think about this, and particularly I would encourage all of you to look at the report. There's a lot that's very subtle, again, that doesn't really hit you between the eyes, but this sense of so many of your respondents from the private sector that they felt some ownership of their education, that they felt, and they couldn't necessarily translate that into some other obvious currency, a degree, an income, a dollar sign, but they look back on that part of their life as positively formative. And after all, it's a lot of your life. And if there's only one finding that stood out for me, and I'll be frank about it, it was that one. It was the sense that the data I've seen from the public school sector is so often a sense of sort of gray nothingness, obviously percolated by personal reminiscences and relationships and individual catastrophes and triumphs. But that really did suggest a whole avenue of inquiry that we simply hadn't opened. So I want to thank you and your colleague, David, and all of the respondents, and to you, the audience, for wonderful questions. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.